I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and there's a chance I might regret doing this video, but I think I know how to approach it in such a way that I should be able to get the point I'm trying to make across without getting feathers ruffled, basically. We'll see, though. What inspired this video? It doesn't really matter because this topic seems to come in waves anyway. The question we are going to address today is exactly how political the Godzilla series as a whole actually is. Because that seems to be a topic that keeps coming up regularly. There are people who say that they don't want politics inserted into the Godzilla series, usually referring to a very particular kind of politics that's not very popular among the common man, which always gets a response of, why would you say that? Godzilla has always been political and always will be. Of course, that's kind of branching off from the mindset that all media is always political without exceptions, an absolutism that has been disproven time and time again. But I'm not going to deny that there are political elements in the Godzilla series. The question is, exactly how political is it when you really look at it? Before we get to that, though, perhaps I should define what I mean when I say political. You see, I am of the opinion that political elements can appear in a story without necessarily providing political commentary. Sometimes the story just requires something like the presence of a political figure or something to be present. Or sometimes a theme can work its way in, and it wasn't necessarily what was intended by the storyteller, but when somebody else experiences that story and puts all the pieces together, they wind up finding it anyway, which means it's all just coincidental. The way I define a political story, at least, and I hope you guys all agree with me because this is the one I'm going to use going forward, is that it has to be specifically designed to convey a message that is specifically political. Whether it is a topic directly concerning a form of government, or if it's about a topic that has been co-opted to become political, which happens far too often if you ask me, because there are some things that just shouldn't be political, but that's a whole other point. That's the way I define it. If your story is designed to specifically convey a message, and that message has something to do with politics, whatever that political message might be, that is what we mean by a political story. And of course, there's more than one way to go about that sort of thing. There's the way in which you present all these different elements, examine a particular topic as thoroughly as you can, oftentimes requiring you to look at both sides, or if there's more than 2 sides, all sides of a particular case, and then either drawing a conclusion or perhaps leaving it up to the audience to decide what conclusion is the best one. And then there's the one where you just declare that everyone you don't like is Hitler, and you throw a tantrum when somebody expresses an opinion that doesn't line up exactly with your own. I prefer the former example myself, but that's just me. So, if we all agree on that, we're going to move forward. If you don't agree on that, I'm going to move forward anyway, because that's what I'm here to do. Okay, so as of this video's posting, there are 38 Godzilla movies, including all the American ones. How many of those 38 movies are specifically political? Well, here's my tally. Obviously, there is the first Godzilla movie. No one can deny that that is a very politically charged film. Some people don't always count this next one, but I'm going to count Godzilla Raids again, because if you've seen my video on that subject, you know that I see it as being allegorical for the Cold War, but not so much from a political aspect specifically as it is from the everyday perspective of knowing that there are these two giant superpowers trying to kill each other in your general vicinity, Anguirus and Godzilla representing Russia and America. I say it counts. King Kong vs. Godzilla, generally considered to be a satirization of capitalism and consumerism, so we can count that. Mothra vs. Godzilla, aka Godzilla vs. the Thing. The villains are evil capitalist businessmen who exploit Mothra's egg and so on and so forth. That seems pretty politically charged to me. Then we get Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Can't deny that one. Obvious environmentalist message. So that one's about as blatant as it can be. Jumping ahead again, we have The Return of Godzilla, aka Godzilla 1985. Cold War themes and imagery laid on thick. Then we have Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, examining the consequences and potential outcome of Japan's economic miracle, with a combination of elements examining Japan's World War II history. Not necessarily in the best light, but, well, I've already said my piece about that. Then we have GMK, which definitely has elements about criticizing historical revisionism and taking a little bit of an examination of government red tape in Japan and having respect for the past. There is a political element there. And then there's Shin Godzilla, which is so saturated with politics that they barely were able to fit anything else in there, and so they didn't. That's only 9 movies out of the current 38. So 1 out of every 12 or 13 movies is specifically political. Now, there are 2 upcoming Godzilla movies that would round it out to an even 40, currently entitled Godzilla Zero from Toho and Godzilla and Kong from Legendary. Whether those titles wind up being the final ones or not, we don't know. But for now, let's just do a little speculation and assume that Godzilla Zero, being set in post-war Japan, might have some sort of political aspect to it, while Godzilla and Kong, being the successor to Godzilla vs. Kong, is probably going to go more for escapism. In that case, if that winds up being true, and again, that's just speculation, that would bring the tally up to 10 out of 40, or, as it's more commonly known, 1/4. Now, 1/4 is not a small amount, of course, but it's not a very big amount either. And I know some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute, there are other movies that have political elements in them. Didn't you leave some of them out? Well, that's why I specified earlier that I believe that stories can have political elements in them without necessarily being political. For example, let's take Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, or as it's known in Japan, Invasion of Astro Monster. There are scenes that take place in the Capitol building with meetings of the Japanese Senate and various government officials throughout the film. Why? Because the story is about making first contact with an alien civilization. That is a very big event, and you would expect, in light of such an event, that governments would get involved somehow. As such, the reason those elements are there is because it's realistic that they would be there. And it's not necessarily conveying any sort of specific message about how the government is run, or how things would be better if there was a change up in the hierarchy or something. It's just there because it's necessary to the story. Godzilla vs. Biollante has an espionage element to it, where, again, you have those last lingering elements of the Cold War factoring into the story, but the overall message being told, like, whenever there's a big speech that's meant to be the "this is what you should be thinking about" kind of speech, it's about Frankenstein science, about genetic manipulation, about how you can try to do something with science for good, but if you're not careful, you might wind up doing something bad. And that's not an inherently political idea. That's just a scientific idea. A person in their garage who's just mixing chemicals is technically doing science, but they're not necessarily doing so on the government dollar. Yes, the espionage element is there, where we have elements of tension between America, Japan, and a made-up Middle Eastern country. But those elements mostly exist to move the plot forward. Other than saying that it only overcomplicates matters, I don't really see anything that sticks out as a blatant political commentary. Or you have the 1998 Godzilla, yes, I know, but it counts, where you again have an espionage element, but it again is mostly there just to move things forward. The closest that ever comes to saying anything especially political is a little bit about patriotism. But then again, patriotism is not necessarily defined specifically by liking your government. There's a reason that the saying that's come up about patriotism recently is patriotism is loving your country all the time and your government when it's earned the trust. But, dissecting the ins and outs of patriotism, that's a whole other topic. For the most part, though, Godzilla 98 doesn't really have anything blatantly political to say beyond that either. It's got sort of a gung-ho, let's go America attitude to it, but that's in all of Roland Emmerich's films. And you might be thinking, well, what about the mayor and his aide? Well, the mayor and his aide are not political caricatures. They are actually caricatures of Siskel and Ebert, who had a tendency to be really harsh on Roland Emmerich movies, so he basically caricatured them as a giant middle finger, which they thought he didn't even go far enough with. So, not political satire. What about the American Godzilla movies from the monsterverse? There's an environmental aspect, it's true, but once you start really digging into the themes of that movie, it's not so much about politics as it is about man's relationship with nature or man's relationship with God. The two of those are actually kind of intertwined in the monsterverse, which, again, those are not necessarily inherently political. Then, of course, you have the Godzilla movies, which have messages, but they're not really political messages, they're more ethical or moral messages. I already mentioned Godzilla vs. Biollante and the Frankenstein science commentary. We also have stuff like Godzilla's Revenge, or as it's known in Japan, All Monsters Attack. That message from that movie is that if you're a kid who's being bullied, you should stand up to your bullies and fight for yourself. They'll back off. And no, that's not an allegory for the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie. It's literally about telling children to stand up to their bullies. Whether or not it conveyed that message properly is a whole other issue. But that is literally what it's about. It couldn't be less political if it tried. To a certain degree, Mothra vs. Godzilla also falls under that category because, again, you could look at it and say that the corrupt businessmen, while yes, they might be the product of extreme unchecked capitalism, they're also just really rotten people. Their crime is not so much that they got rich in a capitalist system, but more that they're exceptionally greedy and exploitative and have no scruples when they're in desperate times. In fact, on Infant Island, the big message is conveyed in which it says that really the entire culture should not be punished for the sins of a select few. Then, of course, you have some movies that seem to be setting up messages and yet don't actually do anything with them. Like, for example, Godzilla 2000. In the first little bit of the movie, we learn that Godzilla is specifically targeting energy resources, places that generate energy for cities. And then we learn that the CCI is excavating the meteorite because they're looking for a new kind of energy source. And after we've established these facts, they are both completely forgotten. And the rest of the movie is about how there's a UFO that looks like a bicycle seat zipping around, and Godzilla is chasing after it because he wants to destroy it because he sees it as competition. That's what the movie is about. There's really nothing else after that. Or you have my personal favorites, the movies that, for all intents and purposes, should be escapism, but still decide to tack on a moral at the very end to make it seem like they were profound. The latter-day Heisei movies were especially guilty of this, where they all stand in a row watching Godzilla wade back into the sea, and they're like, this whole adventure where we piloted a crappy robot in order to help Godzilla fight this weird crystal clone of himself really has me thinking that we shouldn't be dumping junk in outer space. I mean, Come on, that's not what people were thinking when they were watching that movie. Then of course you have Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, which goes along just telling a story that's relatively not political, until suddenly, after the title fight has concluded, you get this exposition dump about this conspiracy that's been going on behind the scenes, and it got so little attention before that, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it came right out of left field. It doesn't really even go anywhere after that because the circumstances in which this conspiracy exists can only ever be applied to the circumstances of the movie. So, no real world application. I wouldn't exactly call that a proper political message. Okay, so I think I've made my point by now. There are not that many political Godzilla movies, but there are some. And of those, well, I notice a certain shared mindset among various people who make the argument that Godzilla is always political. And I've wanted to shout this at them for a while now, but I'm not going to. I'm going to say it just calmly. Just because something is political doesn't mean it adheres to your politics. It probably, in fact, does not line up with them, if you really look at it. Let's not forget, Japan is a different culture from America. And America is where this particular discussion is most often happening. America and like Western Europe. But Japan has its own culture, it has its own political views. They're not necessarily going to line up with American political views. Plenty of hyper-political people in America are all for environmentalism. Godzilla vs. Hedorah is all about environmentalism. But what does it offer as an alternative to burning fossil fuels? Nuclear energy. Because Godzilla powers the device that kills Hedorah with his nuclear heat ray. I have learned from experience that people can get very testy when you point this out. The reason they get testy is because environmentalists in the West tend to be adamantly opposed to nuclear energy as a green fuel alternative. And I'm not going to go into any sort of debate about where I stand on that issue, but I will say that with that in mind, it's certainly Godzilla vs. Hedorah is certainly a liberal film, but it's not that liberal. In the original Godzilla, you can look at certain things like the disappointing depiction of the then new government, or the scene where a crowd of people cheers on a fleet of Zeros as they chase Godzilla back into the ocean, and get the sense that the movie is kind of longing for things to return to the good old days. The days of the Empire, which was not really good for anyone that wasn't Japanese. Mothra vs. Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Mothra are both films that take umbrage with capitalist industrialists, so they're definitely on the left side of the spectrum. But then you look at something like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. In that movie, we learn that in the far-flung future, Japan has become so wealthy as a nation under capitalism that they are able to become the largest nation in the world by outright buying continents that are worse off than they are. And this is seen as a dystopian cyberpunk hellscape by the villains who wish to undo it. So if the villains are opposed to Japan buying the world, that means that we're meant to see it as a good thing. And this is on top of their particular whitewashing of their history in World War II. I wouldn't say that's an especially liberal film. Although, the whitewashing of their World War II history is addressed in GMK. So that flops back to the other side. But then you have Shin Godzilla, which is considered an especially conservative film. How conservative, you may ask? Well, I have heard reports that it is especially popular among Japan's far right. So make of that what you will. So looking at the movies that are political, I'm getting the sense that they don't lean exclusively to one side or the other. It's really more of a case-by-case basis if those movies are more to the left or more to the right, or just somewhere in the middle. So, again, they are political, but they're not adhering to one specific form of politics. But what happens when we add other Godzilla media into the mix? Well, I mean, that would take us a while to really go through all the different examples, but let's see if I can just briefly summarize. If we look at the cartoons or the animated series, I wouldn't say any of them are political. Hanna-Barbera cartoon, not really political at all. TriStar sequel cartoon, again, little bits of environmentalism, little bits of gung-ho pro-militariness, but mostly just there to be an entertaining monster romp. Godzilla Singular Point, I'm not sure anyone knows what that one is actually about, but I can tell you it's not about politics. Looking at comics, and excluding stuff like the manga that just adapt the movie plots, because those are just rehashing the movies, like I said, we have Dark Horse and Marvel, who didn't really do politics all that much. And of the various IDW Godzilla comics, having gone through them all, the only two I can say are actually actively political in the definition I set up earlier are Kingdom of Monsters and Monsters and Protectors. And even then, Kingdom of Monsters only was political up to a certain point. With anthology stuff like Rivals and Legends, there are some individual issues that contain political elements, but for the most part, they remain largely apolitical. So I would not count them as political in general. And then, of course, you have stuff like Godzilla vs. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which, do I even need to say that's not about anything other than having a crossover for its own sake? Then we get to stuff like the Wonderland Records audio drama, which, again, doesn't really have much in the way of politics in it. And as for the collectibles, I mean, if you must assign politics to pieces of plastic that you have to buy in the store, that's 100% capitalism. But otherwise, that's just plastic. It has no political opinion. All right, maybe it's time to hit the brakes here and go back to that initial question. How political is the Godzilla series? I think I have an objective answer for you. And that objective answer is, as a whole, big picture sense, it's largely not interested in politics. If you go by an individual case-by-case basis, there are political entries within. But just because they are political entries does not mean they adhere exclusively to one particular brand of politics. What politics they adhere to depends on who's making them. So having established all of that, I'd like to take a moment to just speak directly to you, the people watching. You guys are Godzilla fans, I assume, or else you wouldn't be watching this video, right? Now, I know that some of you like watching Godzilla movies or reading Godzilla comics and so on because they can provide commentary and make you think about deeper issues. And I know there are some of you who prefer to just watch these movies and read these comics and so on because giant monsters are cool and it's neat to see them smash stuff and fight each other. As far as I'm concerned, either way is okay by me. There is no wrong way to enjoy Godzilla, just like there is no wrong way to eat a Reese's. If you like the commentary, like it for the commentary. If you like it for the spectacle, like it for the spectacle. If you don't want commentary in your spectacle, cool. If you prefer that they lighten the spectacle and focus more on the commentary, whatever. It doesn't bother me. I know for a fact that many of my subscribers don't always agree with the things I put forward in these videos. But you know what? When we disagree, we usually disagree respectfully. And we know that it's no big deal if we disagree. That's one of the things I love about my subscribers, by the way. I think we've set a pretty good example, if I do say so myself. So, the way I see it, enjoy Godzilla however you want, but forcing people to see it exclusively the way you see it, that's just not good. Nothing good comes of that. We've seen far too many fandoms split because of things like that. And I don't want to see that happen to the Godzilla fandom. This is why I went through and did my assessment. I acknowledge that there are political Godzilla entries. There are also Godzilla entries that are not political, and they comprise the majority. Doesn't mean they don't have anything to say, mind you. But if you prefer watching the political ones, watch them. Let other people enjoy their spectacle. People who enjoy the spectacle, let the ideologues enjoy the political ones. And let's just all remember that the thing which unites us is that we are, at the end of the day, Godzilla fans. And that's all I had to say for this particular one. Well, hopefully I said it in such a way that got the point across without getting people upset. It's always hard to tell because politics can be a really tricky subject. But I guess that's up to you guys to tell me how good a job I did. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books, Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.